And start the conference with just a set of slides giving you a much broader overview on this whole important area. In fact, if you look at the literature, you'll find that this is the only center like this in the world, internationally, that really recognizes and values the importance of health and wellness for people with disabilities through the medium of research and development using engineers, developers, and exercise scientists. So with that, I think part of what my role is in the next 10 or 15 minutes is to kind of lay out the scenario of where we're going and why we're doing this. And if you look at the national U.S. guidelines, and we know how important guidelines are, we have evidence-based guidelines that the Institute of Medicine has developed. Hospitals all over the country use those guidelines to treat patients. We also have guidelines in physical activity. And I had the good fortune in 2008 to be on that committee. There were 13 members on that committee who developed a very comprehensive, scientifically sound set of guidelines on what all Americans should be involved in. And in that document, when it was boiled down, it basically said that you need 150 minutes a week of aerobic physical activity, roughly 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And also the element that was added from the previous guidelines and the Surgeon General's reports was the fact that the scientists recognized the importance of resistance exercise. So 75 minutes a week of resistance exercise using different muscle groups was extremely critical. And again, I don't want to preach to the choir. You all know the importance of resistant exercise from the standpoint of keeping sound musculoskeletal integrity. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that if these are the guidelines, right, this is based on the highest level of evidence, there are people with disabilities achieving those guidelines. And sadly, when you look at the literature, and this was a colleague of mine, Diane Carroll from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, looked at the most recent data set from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, and basically showed that in the population that we're very interested in, people with mobility disabilities, between the ages of 18 and 64, 57% of people with mobility disabilities are not achieving just the aerobic portion. The resistance portion, the numbers were even higher. They were in the 80s and 90s. So we have a real problem on our hands. If we've got a guideline that says this is the way you prevent pressure ulcers, and every hospital in the nation is adherent to that because the evidence shows that if you turn someone every 2 hours, if you use the right kind of cushion, if you ensure that the person is up and at them and that they're not soiled, these are the guidelines that make that experience in the hospital and the reduction of a very serious injury called pressure sores preventable. We have the same guidelines, and yet when you look at the data, people with disabilities are not able to successfully adhere to 225 minutes a week of activity. And that's, from a political standpoint, just plain out wrong. And we're here today, and I'm going to go ahead and I hope John doesn't use this quote, but when I went to the last conference he was at, he said, we're not here to admire the problem. And I want to just echo that statement, and I'm sure John is going to sort of give you an overview about what that means, but we're really here to figure out how to do this. So today's meeting is, we've got the best scientists, engineers, developers in the country in this room, and it's really about trying to address this problem of a very high rate of inactivity. We've got guidelines that nobody seems to either understand or try to embellish or implement, and we end up with a very difficult situation where many, many people are not achieving the recommended health benefits associated with activity. Now, if you look at the whole area of physical activity, disability, and aging, there are some complementary overlaps. And this particular slide shows you that if we just look at barriers, right, just think about barriers to getting active. We have to keep that in mind today as you go through your presentations, and those of you in the room who are discussing this, that the base of the model here is where people with disabilities are located. So when you look at the literature and you say, what are all the barriers associated with activity? Disability, people who have disabilities, have the highest number of those barriers. Those barriers are, obviously the architectural barriers. Much of the equipment that's housed in health clubs and fitness facilities is largely inaccessible. It's hard to get to and from a facility. The amount of time required to get prepared to do activity is probably 2 to 4 times higher. Just getting dressed, undressed, getting into the pool, getting transferred, so on and so forth. And so those complexities are increased over time as someone with a disability starts to age, and now it becomes more and more difficult. So we've got to think of that if we get this country to think about that, if we can address the base of the model and develop universal access to health and wellness, then everybody above that, older adults, minorities, and the general population will benefit. And it's the same thing. You see the analogy with curb cuts, right? Curb cuts were developed for a specific need, and now everybody, swears by them, and they're in every community in America. The other part of activity I think we need to keep in mind is that you don't have to be a marathoner to get these enormous benefits. And if you look at this graph, this was developed by Russ Pate back in 1995 in the publication in the Journal of Medical Association. He basically said you get a lot of bang for the buck from even low intensity activity. And if those of you in the room who are exercise physiologists, low intensity physical activity is somewhere around 3 mets, 2 to 3 mets, 1 to 3 mets. The whole concept here is that you don't have to go out and do a lot. In fact, that 150 minutes a week can be spread out 2 or 3 times a day, 10, 15 minutes each segment. So keep that in mind as we start to think about how do we get more access to physical activity, not only in the community but also in the home, and what can we do as with technology to get to the fringes of those who are completely inactive, and even a small dose of activity can have enormous health protection. The second part of this is that I've been, in the last few years of my career, thinking about this whole concept of transformative exercise. And that is that, we often throw the kitchen sink at someone when they begin to think about doing exercise. And I feel that, we now have enough evidence and information to really sort of break out physical activity based on the person's current health profile, and also where they're at in terms of recovering from an injury or trying to protect themselves from further chronic conditions. So if you look at this model, this transformative exercise continuum, it's basically suggesting that as we start to look at someone either acquiring a disability or having an exacerbation associated with a disability, we sort of see this suboptimal level of health and function, as you can see on the left-hand side. And then over time, what we want to try to do as scientists and as personal health coaches is we want to bring people along and get them above the threshold of health and function. And so a lot of the green and the blue are really where physical therapists and occupational therapists sort of house themselves. But what we have to think about today is that without lifetime activity attached to rehabilitation, the dose of rehabilitation is not going to be enough to keep that person on a trajectory of health. So today we have to begin to think about almost a policy directive that when a person leaves the hospital, it's mandatory for that physician to say, look, you have a new level of function, and we think that you should go to X, Y, and Z in order to get a healthful physical activity program. And our job is to try to make sure that that environment and the work we're doing is conducive to that person being able to optimize the experience that we all have. So I really believe that we need a transformative exercise solution to this, and part of it is to recognize that you have to identify where this person is. Are they still in the stages of recovery? And once they achieve that level, they're not done, which many people who come out of rehab think, oh, I'm done. I got to the level of threshold, I'm being discharged, and I'm done. Well, no, that's not the case, because there are many other elements of health that can be achieved through the medium of physical activity. That's the beauty of our center, is that we've got the opportunity to take a very important biological change and provide it to people with disabilities all over the world. But we've got to think about how to do that in a systematic way, because it's just not one size fits all. So that's what this model is about. And then finally, when you get through the conditioning stage, you also see people, even at our foundation, that Jeff Underwood directs, where people say, okay, I've gotten to a certain level, I've kind of plateaued, so I'm done. And they stop coming, or they come less frequently. No, it doesn't work like that, right? It's the use it or lose it. If you stop running or you stop exercising, you sort of fall back a few notches, and then all of a sudden you end up in this mode where you've now got a new chronic condition. Your diabetes is higher, you've got this advanced atherosclerotic disease, you've got a little bit of depression, you don't feel as well. So there are so many enormous benefits associated with physical activity, and yet when you look at society in general, they trivialize it as, so I don't exercise, what's the big deal? And so if we take this transformative exercise model today and you think about it, the first stage is really this focus area called rehabilitation. And no one doubts the importance and the value of rehabilitation. So we certainly need to think about it, but we need to add on to that once that person leaves the hospital setting, they need to come to a place like Lakeshore Foundation and they need to get condition-specific exercise. So as you start to think about exercise technologies and the interactive technology aspect, right? Because part of the title of our name is interactive, means the person engaged with someone else. And if you don't have that social element associated with activity, you really have nothing. Because the last thing someone's going to want to do is go home and exercise in isolation on any type of equipment you give them. Exercise must be socially engaging. It must allow that person to participate in society with others in order to engage in activity that will sustain life for a long time to come. So condition-specific exercise is the second stage. Then we move on to fitness, the condition of fitness, and finally, the physical activity. Okay, so those are the 4 stages to consider during your presentations today. Are you in the fitness area? Are you talking about condition-specific exercise, which you'll hear about in a minute on the second part of my presentation? And then finally, the bottom part of that is when a person comes to Lakeshore, this enormously talented staff makes it very clear to them they are lifetime members. Whether they pay their $50 a month or $30 a month, they are lifetime members of Lakeshore. And that is so critical to convey to them. Because so many people come with a condition like multiple sclerosis where things get worse and they start to decline and they don't want to come anymore. So Lakeshore staff tells the participant, you are a lifetime member and we will do whatever we can, whenever we can for you. So never forget that this is, that you need this is your quote-unquote connectivity to the world of health, wellness, and the optimization of social connectivity. And that's what we need to think about today again, is how do we keep that going. So when not to belabor the point, but I see a big problem in the field, and that is that we've got a lot of clinical exercise trials. You can go to Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation every month, and you can find dozens of articles on exercise training for 12 weeks. And I know Margaret's in the room, and she and I have had many conversations. Do any of those clinical trials ever make it into a translational framework where now you can go to a gym and say, I've got this 12-week program for people with Parkinson's? And the answer is, none of them ever gets to a point where they become an evidence-based public health program. So we've got an enormous problem where we're putting a lot of resources in there, and I'm not saying we shouldn't put any, but we need to balance it out, as you'll see in the model. We need to think about when you do that clinical exercise trial, you need to think of 3 other aspects on engaging that person in a program in the community. Because once those resources go away, once you take away the staffing, the free transportation, the accessible equipment, the motivation, the social connectivity, you basically stripped the entire structure of what is needed for a person to engage in lifetime activity. So the clinical exercise trials are one element of this, but there's a lot more to it. So we put together a model, and our site reviewer, Randy Keyser, is in the room. So Randy, this is sort of the outcome of your site visit and challenging us to say, come up with a model that we can begin to study and test. And so we believe that there are 6 elements to exercise adherence, and that is obviously the social engagement is important. It has to be enjoyable. Very often people do it. They go to dance clubs or dance lessons to learn, so learning is a big piece. Exploratory, I call those the mall walkers. They go out shopping on Saturday and Sunday. They just like to go out and explore, but they're getting very low intensity activity. But you got your weekend bikers. They go out and they bike all over the city. That's exploratory. Competitive, it could be individual competition among yourself, or it could be competitive against someone else, either virtually, or it could be as high as the Paralympics, training on site and then going to Brazil to compete on the international platform. And then finally, there's something called task completed. And this is a very small percentage of people who say, I've got to get my 30 minutes a day, most days of the week. That's me. If I don't exercise, I felt like the major task has not been completed. So I'm hoping that as we think about today's presentations, you take the SELECT model and you try to relate it to what elements are you working on. The other thing that we need to think about is this whole idea of a telehealth framework. And I know that the dean, my dean, Harold Jones, is going to speak to the importance of telehealth and also the importance of engaging rehab students early on in the process of allowing them to understand how telehealth works and how we need to begin to think about the inside out. How do you get into the person's home who might be in a very low resource neighborhood or community, had a recent stroke or spinal cord injury, how do we get those rehab students to understand that culture, you know, at the beginning of a program rather than the end? I have a daughter that just went through the OT program, and it's a fantastic program. But I kept thinking about what would it be like if she started in Bessemer, Alabama, where you've got a very deep pocket of poverty, you've got rates of disability that are probably in the high 40s, low 50s, and you can't get that information out of a textbook. So we need to think of also transforming the way we train students, including engineering students, and then put them out in the community. And we believe that in RecTech, telehealth is going to be the wave of the future. It doesn't necessarily mean we won't have Lakeshore foundations across the country, but we will hopefully continue to push that mantra and that need. But in the interim, we have people right now, millions of people, who have no activity access at all. So telehealth might be a great way to do this. And I've broken telehealth down into these three areas: tele-exercise, tele-assessment and monitoring, and telemeasurement. And then also we've got this Getting Beyond Plateau, which is something that I sort of framed from Margaret Campbell's presentation in September. This health information technology from therapists to telecoach to trainers is very critical. So again, it's that whole concept of we can never forget that once a person transitions from rehab to condition-specific exercise to fitness, that last stage is really lifetime activity, and they may need, you know, sort of a starter, or they may need a, you know, a bolus of online tele-exercise to get them re-engaged and to have them return to the program. The other nice feature about RecTech is that its sister, or maybe I should say its brother agency, is CDC, and we were very fortunate. It's still not public yet, but we were very fortunate to receive word from the Centers for Disease Control that we've been refunded, and that the amount of money that they've given us this cycle is 50% higher than what they gave us in the past. So the center has gone from 3 years to 5 years, and is significantly higher in terms of the resources. And what this slide shows is that, you know, we don't have to spend a lot of money on dissemination and implementation in RecTech because we've got NICPAD. So the hope now is that we take what we learn from in the projects and we bring it through the portal of NICPAD, which is the entree to the world. There's not a person that you don't meet that's in the area of disability or physical activity that hasn't heard of the center. So we've got good name recognition, and we believe that the projects that you're involved in can be translated through NICPAD. And then finally, we've got our new RAM, which is what we call RecTech RAM 2.0, Restoring Access, Mobility, and Participation. And you're going to hear a lot about today each of these projects. So we have 3 research and we have 3 development. But the more important part of this model is that, you know, in order for you to have any credibility whatsoever in any project you're working on, you have to be able to talk, where are you in the space of rehab engineering and exercise? And you can't make that talk, and Bill Schutz and I had a wonderful 2-hour conversation yesterday about how we need to do a better job of getting consumers to express the benefits that they're achieving from Lakeshore Foundation and from this Rehab Engineering Center. So we definitely need to think about, you know, a much broader social media campaign, which certainly we can do through NICPAD. But the more important element of this is that we're now connected to the International Classification of Function and Disability in Health. So we've got a validated model that all our projects can be tied to, so we can start to code in the future what are the elements that this individual needs in order to be re-engaged. And that's just the kind of a schematic, the color schematic of where the heaviest dose of activity is now being located in RecTech. But what's so nice about this is you go up to a researcher, they have an idea, and you can say, where do you fit on this mapping tool? So future directions, and I'll just close by saying, I show this slide all the time, it breaks my heart. Margaret Campbell and I have worked very long on the whole idea of secondary conditions and the disparities of secondary health conditions among people with disabilities. And if you look at this model, you can see that the red bar, which is representing people with disabilities, the rates of arthritis, chronic pain, contractions, deconditioning, falls, fatigue, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on. And these particular conditions are things that rehab engineers can really treat. And if we get that telehealth platform, we can have OT and PT students working at the early stages of preventing further pain or trying to address pain or fatigue in its early onset. So we think it's a great opportunity. And not only do you see a significantly higher rate of secondary conditions, but look at the psychosocial secondary conditions. Anxiety, 4 times, 5 times higher. Communication difficulties, depression, difficulties accessing things, isolation. You know, these are all mutable things that can be changed, particularly through the medium of exercise. And again, I don't have time to go over this, but we do have a stages of change model. Margaret Campbell sent me this wonderful article by Onken, O-N-K-E-N. If you haven't read it, you should see it. And so I kind of just revised this for our purposes. And we start with stage 0, which is product development, and you'll hear a lot about that today. And then the first level of research is stage 1, exploration and discovery. And then you go on to efficacy trials. Then you go on to multi-site efficacy trials. So, you know, a place like in Phoenix, they have a center that deals very similar with the activities that Lakeshore is doing. So once you get through efficacy and you find the program works at Lakeshore, now you want to translate it, you can get several organizations around the country to work at doing this at a multi-sites level. Then you get to your effectiveness, which we believe is through the portal of telehealth. And then finally, it enters into this area of knowledge adaptation and translation. So we now have the bookends for a research continuum. We have RecTech on the front end, producing products, testing them in an exploratory discovery stage, and then we have NICPAD to pick up those products and translate them. So we never lose the opportunity to take those clinical exercise trials and move them along the continuum, and we've got a home that's waiting for something like that in NICPAD, particularly now with this increased source of funding. So it's a very nice model, one that I'd like you to consider for your own future careers. And finally, when we think about health, we need to use this quote: health is like money. We never have a true idea of its value until we lose it. And people don't think about health, and yet that is the most important thing that should be on everyone's mind today and in the future. That without health, we really don't have anything. And people can be as healthy as possible, any individual, with the right type of program and the right type of support. So here are examples of people that I've worked over my years. I've been in this field for 25 years. A few of these photos of people that I started with in Chicago in 1997 with my first grant from CDC, in the waiting room, trying to get them engaged in activity. This is where we need to be. We need a new structure for RecTech, which we call this RecTech's Future, Powers 2.0. And if you look at these images, they all have something to do with wearables, which you're going to hear about today. So we need people to plug in a wearable. We need telecoaches. We need active video games that people can do quickly and enjoy it and be perhaps competitive even online. We've got a wonderful studio that Dean Jones will be talking about in this telehealth lab, where people can do something called movement to music. We just got a brand new NIH grant to do movement to music online with colleagues Mohan and Tappan Nato, who's in the back of the room. So there's now an energy in the federal agency that recognizes what you do and values so much of what you do in order to make it right from a political, sociological standpoint. So never, ever doubt that the value of your work is so incredibly important to this country, and that it must continue in order for us to achieve what you all would like to see, and that is complete universal design and universal access to physical activity. And someday, maybe we come back here in 5 years, 10 years, and look at this image and say, these are people who have embraced physical activity and have gotten an enormous out of it. So with that, I thank you for listening to this very brief opening, and I'm going to turn it over now to my dean, Dr. Harold Jones,